Thank you for joining us today for the National Center for Rural Road Safety's November 1st webinar, co-sponsored by the NL-TAPA Safety Work Group. My name is Jamie Sullivan, and I am the Director for the National Center for Rural Road Safety. Today, we're really excited to bring you some recently released rural countermeasure resources that would be very useful for you all. We have just a few logistics to run through first. Today's webinar will be an hour and a half long. Closed captioning is available. The link will be posted in the chat pod right now and has been emailed out. Additionally, this webinar is being recorded and it will be available on our website in our webinar archive off of our main training dropdown. For today's webinar, if you have any questions for the presenters or if you need to alert the organizers of any technical difficulties, please use the question and answer pod that you should find over to the right-hand side of your screen. Additionally, we have two handouts available for you today. One is the PowerPoint version of what I'm presenting right now and what our first speaker will be presenting. The second one is the toolbox from Vermont that will be presented by our second speaker. So please make sure you head over to the handout pod and download both of those resources that are available for you. At the end of today's webinar, we will have a survey. We would ask that you please complete that to let us know how this webinar worked out for you and also to give us some suggestions of what you'd like to see as we're starting to prepare our webinar topics for next year, and we'd love to know what you would like to hear from us. Lastly, certificates of completion will be available for this webinar. They will be sent out within a few weeks. And in addition to that will be an application in case you would need the CEUs from the university. As a reminder, when you do fill out those CEU forms, please make sure that you send them back to the email address that will be located in the top right-hand corner of that form. They do go to Montana State University and not to the National Center for Rural Road Safety. Today we have two presenters. Our very first presenter is Jay Otto. He's a researcher and co-director for the Center for Health and Safety Culture. Jay holds an MS in electrical engineering from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He leads the research efforts for the Center for Health and Safety Culture, which consists of research design, survey design, and interpretation and quantitative analysis. He also serves as a trainer, and he uses his experience working in communities to improve health and safety to make his research applied and valuable to practitioners in the field. Our second presenter today will be Jim Sullivan, who is a senior research analyst at the University of Vermont
Jamie, excuse me, I just wanted you to know your screen is cutting off Jim's side. We're only seeing half of the slide, just Jay.
I
don't know if you can scroll over from the bottom.
Nope, because I can see it all. Is that better? Can you see it now?
Are you presenting in the 16
PowerPoint mode like you had it? That'll be okay. Good.
Okay, sorry about that. So Jim is a senior research analyst for the University of Vermont's Transportation Research Center. He leads projects in the research areas of land use and transportation modeling, traffic flow, transportation energy and system efficiency, and winter maintenance. His modeling research has included applications of critical infrastructure modeling using risk-based methods for passenger vehicle transport, freight transport, delivery of emergency services, and provisions of snow and ice control, all under disruptive scenarios created by severe weather. He currently maintains and operates the statewide travel demand model for Vermont under contract to the Vermont Agency of Transportation, along with a variety of research projects related to transportation demand, traffic flows, travel behavior, and energy use. And we're very excited to have both of them here with us today. Our first resource that will be talked about will be the BitScript Research Report 8, Highway Safety Behavioral Strategies for Rural and Tribal Areas, a guide. And I will drop the links to both of these into the chat pod as soon as I'm done presenting and hand over the slides to Jay. Our second one will be that traffic safety toolbox addressing speeds. And again, I'll put this link into the chat pod, but this also is the second handout that you have available in the handout pod over to the right. And at this time, I'm going to turn our presentation over to Jay.
Great. Thank you very much, Jamie. And I really appreciate that setup. It's wonderful. I'm a remote employee for Montana State University. So while MSU is in Bozeman, Montana, I actually live in Vermont. So it's really cool. I get to enjoy all the cool countermeasures that Jim's going to talk about on our roads. And I liked his introduction where he was also talking about navigating them in difficult weather. As I'm looking out my window from where I am in Vermont right now, the snow is pouring down. So it's our first big snow for the season, which is very exciting. All right, so I want to talk a little bit. I am, as Jamie mentioned, I'm a researcher with the Center for Health and Safety Culture. And the center, what we do at the center is seek to understand how culture, that is shared values and beliefs, impact decisions that ultimately influence or impact health and safety outcomes. And so we do a lot of work in traffic safety, but we also do work in other areas, and it's interesting to see how those overlap. But we are very interested in traffic safety culture and how traffic safety culture influences the decisions that a lot of different stakeholders make, the decisions that road users make, but lots of other stakeholders as well. So that's a little bit about the center, and we contributed to a project which Jamie mentioned. It was a BitScript project, the Behavioral Traffic Safety Cooperative Research Program, and it was BTS 15, and it involved many different components, but we're just going to talk about one component today, the guide. But just so you know, yes, that same Jamie Sullivan, she led this project as well. There were a number of folks at the center who contributed to this guide, as well as Kara Heyman from University of Iowa. The full report and the guide are available through links and through the national academies. I'll talk more about that, but don't be intimidated when you go to that page and it says buy this book. You don't have to pay anything to get it. I don't know why they use that link, but you can get the guide and the report for no cost. The overall project really wanted to explore and really bring forth best practices for rural and tribal settings to work on traffic safety, and in particular from a behavioral lens. So thinking about a behavioral focus, less of an engineering focus. Jim's going to talk more about that. And what came out of this research really was that there was a lack of research that had been done on behavioral strategies, specifically in rural and tribal settings. So that was a real challenge because they wanted to create a listing of all those behavioral strategies, but really there hasn't been sufficient research to give that list. So instead, we had to develop a guide that sort of helped people deal with that issue where we are now. Like, how do we move forward without that list of strategies that have been evaluated for rural and tribal settings? And that was really the focus of the guide. So the guide has 5 chapters, an introduction, and then we wanted to spend a little bit of time and talk about how behavioral strategies work, because this is going to be really important, and you're going to understand more about that in a moment. We then wanted to provide some guidance and helping folks think about their work of selecting and implementing strategies, behavioral strategies in particular, but traffic safety in general, as a process that is repeated, and it gives us guidance on what to do next. Then we did have a specific chapter on how to identify, select, and adapt countermeasures and strategies. And throughout this presentation, I'm going to use the word countermeasures and strategies somewhat synonymously. Traditionally in traffic safety, we often talk about countermeasures. In other settings, folks talk about strategies. So we sort of use both, but know that when I say them, I mean them as in this context as being interchangeable. And finally, when we start thinking about our work as a process that we're going to repeat, and in particular, we're going to repeat the implementation of countermeasures or strategies, we want to start thinking about how we can get better at their implementation. So we added a chapter that was a little bit about evaluative thinking, or just things we can do so that each iteration, when we implement a countermeasure strategy, we get better at doing it. So the first, the introduction is relatively brief, but it does provide an overview of the guide. It also reviews very quickly the safe system approach, but this is very important because we really want to start thinking differently about our approaches, especially when we think about behavioral approaches. In the past, we've really had a strong focus on improving traffic safety by changing road user behavior, and often with a high focus on driver behavior. And now we really want to shift that to thinking about, yes, driver behavior is important, and what about all the behaviors that surround a driver and all the other stakeholders in the transportation system? And how do we really start shifting their behaviors as well to really create an overall comprehensive safe system? And then we do include a list of resources. Throughout the guide, we didn't want to replicate what other folks have already done. We did want to point to them, though. So the guide overall has a lot of other references that it notes so that you can go to those and find them. Many of those are websites which will be updated. So this first introduction just does begin with some of those existing resources that folks can take advantage of. The second chapter really focuses on how behavioral strategies work. And this is really important for folks to understand, especially since we're going to probably have to adapt existing strategies for rural settings. So this chapter talks a little bit about thinking about the work through different sort of buckets. And we want to recognize that the consequences are different from behaviors, are different from beliefs. When we think about traffic safety and we think about consequences, certainly what immediately comes to mind are fatalities and serious injuries, and those should be prioritized, and our primary goal is to really eliminate fatalities and serious injuries. But we also can recognize there are other consequences as well, right? There's tremendous trauma to individuals who may be seriously injured, but there's trauma to their families, especially if there's a fatality. That trauma is extensive. There's also trauma from first responders. And when we think about maintenance crews and all the folks who work on the transportation system and the trauma that they experience through very violent, serious crashes, there are also consequences in terms of healthcare costs, work loss costs, all sorts of different things. So it's important for us to think about all the consequences, but recognize that consequences are different than behaviors. And then if we shift to behaviors, we can recognize there are many different kinds of behaviors that can lead to these consequences. Certainly driver behaviors like impaired or speeding, but there are also other behaviors as well, right? There's the behavior of road design. I mean, that's a behavior. There are decisions around whether a workplace chooses to have traffic safety policies, right? A workplace can decide that it has a seatbelt policy and that it enforces that policy, and that's a behavior. There are behaviors by elected officials to allocate funding to do the kind of work we need to do, or to put forth legislation to change laws. So we want to think really broadly about behaviors, not just road user behaviors. Those are important, but lots of other behaviors too. And then it's valuable to recognize that there are a whole host of beliefs that influence those behaviors. And when we think about road users, we can think about beliefs like, well, it won't happen to me, or I'm a better driver, so I can, use my cell phone while I'm driving. We want to address beliefs like that. But we also want to address beliefs like, growing the notion and helping people understand that roundabouts are safer than other kinds of traditional intersections, and that really no one should drive after consuming alcohol, that we want to move to a place of just not driving after drinking. And we want to think about what kinds of policies we could do as a workplace and how workplace policies can improve the well-being and reduce costs for workplaces. So there are a whole array of beliefs, different beliefs associated with different behaviors. And really all behavioral strategies work by shifting people's beliefs. When we think about any kind of countermeasure that we might do to change people's behavior, they work because they shift people's beliefs. And even some of the strategies that Jim's going to talk about when he talks about sort of countermeasures or designs on the roads, those can shift people's beliefs in a context. So in a very specific setting, when they come across a situation, they're going to look at it and make different kinds of judgments about their behaviors based on how they're interpreting and the beliefs they have about, well, what's it mean if the road is narrower? What's it mean if there's a curve or a stop sign or a roundabout? And they're going to change their behaviors based on that. So we can even think about engineering strategies and impacting through beliefs. But absolutely, behavioral strategies work because they focus on the beliefs. And we really need to understand this when we start bringing in strategies, and particularly if we adapt them. So this chapter talks a bit about this. It includes a training video that helps people create a logic model for any kind of behavioral strategy. And the logic model follows this same idea. What are the beliefs that this countermeasure is trying to change? And why do we think changing those beliefs is going to change a particular behavior? And why do we think changing a particular behavior is going to lead to different consequences? And there are example logic models in an appendix, but it's really important for any countermeasure we do to really understand how it works, so that if we make changes to it, we don't inadvertently take away something that is critical to its functioning. So that's really about chapter 2. Chapter 3 is looking and thinking about improving roadway safety as a process. Sometimes we think about it from, well, I've got to increase seatbelt use. So what do I do to increase seatbelt use? But if we can really think about our work as a process and a series of steps that we're going to go through, that can really help us be more effective. And in particular, recognizing that we're going to repeat these processes over time. And if we can improve our skills within these steps, we will get better outcomes. The work we have to do to get to zero fatalities and serious injuries, is difficult. This is hard work. The United States is not a leader in traffic safety. There are many countries that have better traffic safety than us, and we can learn a lot from them. And even the best countries in the world have not gotten to zero. So this is difficult work. Changing people's behavior is difficult work. We've really got to think about, how are we getting better at it? How are we growing our skills? And how do we learn and improve with each iteration? Because we're not going to do a behavioral countermeasure once. We're going to repeat it, several times a year or year to year. And every time we repeat it, we want to get better at it. So we provide a little bit of guidance on a very basic process. I'm going to talk through, in this guide, we used a very basic 4-step process. We actually point to several different processes that you can learn about through the guide. At the center, we actually use a 7-step process, but they overlap and are similar. The first element or component we're going to talk about is this work to assess. We want to assess before we dive into selecting strategies or countermeasures. To do this, it's really helpful to get some more folks around the table to not do this work alone. Other folks will have different viewpoints as we do the assessment, which is extremely important, and they'll bring very new insights. We also want to gather and review data, and different individuals can help get access to that data. We need to get an accurate understanding of what we're doing, so we do really good database decision making. The data may include things about different kinds of road types. It may include crash data. It may include assessments of particular roads in very specific areas where we've either seen, historically serious injury or fatal crashes, or where we may just look at it and say, I think this area is really a potential high-risk road, even though we haven't had a fatality yet. Let's not wait for one. We may also look at injury reports and things like that. Next, we want to think about planning. and we want to prioritize the problems and the opportunities revealed in the assessment. We can't do it all at once, and especially in rural and tribal settings, resources are limited, staff are limited. So we're going to have to prioritize, and we want to prioritize, because if we try to do it all, we might be a mile wide and an inch deep and not effective at all. So prioritizing makes us more effective. It's difficult. It's difficult to say we're going to focus on this and not that, but it's critical to becoming more effective. And then we're going to want to start to identify, select, and possibly adapt, what are countermeasures or strategies that we might use? And we'll talk more about that. There's a whole chapter on this. So we'll just delay that and come back to that in a second. Then we're going to start thinking about implementation and moving to implement. And implementation is difficult. It's easy to implement poorly. It's harder to implement well. So we're going to have to make sure we've got the resources to implement well, and that folks know how the strategy works so they can really implement to get the outcomes we want. We're also going to want to do some things during implementation that allow us to learn and inform our future efforts, because we know, like I said, we're not going to do this just once. We're going to repeat countermeasures and strategies over and over. So while this is the first time we're doing it, we're the 10th time we're doing it, the next time we do it, we want to do it better. And finally, we do want to have an active step where we pause before we start going into the cycle again, to where we use the information that we gathered during implementation to really make meaning and learn. What went well? What didn't go well? What could we do better? And we've got some guidance for that in the 5th chapter. So this just quickly goes through in this section a bit of a process that folks can use to help guide what to do next. In chapter 4, we specifically provide guidance on the issue of identifying potential strategies. Where can we look for potential strategies? Once we've found some, how might we pick one or more that is a good fit for our community? There might be strategies out there, but they wouldn't work in our community. And then how do we start thinking about adapting that strategy for our setting? Because it may not have been developed or originally done in a rural setting like ours or a tribal setting, and that's going to require us to make some adaptations. We're going to talk a little bit more about that. It's valuable to pause for a moment and just look at sort of broad categories of behavioral and engineering approaches. For behavioral approaches, they tend to fall in about 4 big chunks. There's laws, policies, and rules. So laws are often done by governments, so it might be a state law, or it could be a county or a city ordinance. We may also have policies. Policies often occur in workplaces. They can be very influential. And then we also might have rules, like family rules. And we could think about all those different kinds of mechanisms to influence people's behavior. Along with those, we can think about enforcement and adjudication. So if we have a law, but everybody knows it's not enforced, it may not be very effective. So enforcement becomes an important part of laws, as well as workplace policies. And even if we think about family rules, adjudication is important too. And we want to think about adjudication broadly. It doesn't have to be solely, or definitely doesn't have to be punishment. It could be intervention to change people's behavior, like a DUI court or something like that, which is really addressing the underlying issues around impaired driving and recognizing that simply giving somebody a fine or even putting somebody in jail may not change their behavior if there's an underlying substance use disorder. So adjudication is includes many different things. There's obviously education. Sometimes we need to educate people about the laws. Sometimes we need to educate people about the risks. Sometimes we need to educate people about how to do things to make things safer, and maybe why we're using certain engineering strategies. And we might even have to educate people about how to use a roundabout or how to do zippering if they're going through a construction zone or different things like that. There's also the idea of intervention. How can we teach people to speak up with others it's very difficult, and it's not viable for us to think this is all up to law enforcement to change folks' behavior. We've got to think about how can we speak to our colleagues, our coworkers, our family members if we see somebody doing something that's potentially risky. We can teach people to ask others to wear a seatbelt. We can teach people to say, you know, I don't think you should drive home tonight after drinking. Let's find another way for you to get home. So there's all sorts of different ways we can intervene, and that's a whole nother group of behavioral approaches. Engineering approaches, you've got the design. I think Jim's going to talk a little bit about that. That absolutely can influence people's behavior. You can do treatments on the roadway that influence their behavior. So we can think about different things that are on the road surface, could include rumble strips or other elements that will influence people as they interact with that element on the roadway, and a lot about managing energy. And this is a big conversation we need to have across the board on the behavioral and the engineering side, and really talking about energy, talking about speeds, and ultimately having some difficult conversations around, you know, I think in the past we've had a notion that faster is better, and maybe we need to shift that conversation to slower is safer, and making different decisions about the speeds that are used on roads and speed setting and all sorts of different things, but all towards managing energy, because we know it's the energy that ends up causing serious injuries or fatalities. So in Chapter 4, we do provide some resources to help identify countermeasures and strategies. There are over 12 different resources that you could use to look at and say, oh, are any of these strategies that might make sense for the priorities in our community, and they would align with our community. So we provide some guidance to find those resources. When we think about selecting, it's not that you need to use all of these 16 different factors to consider, but there's something that you might want to consider, because the more you can make a good decision about selecting a strategy or countermeasure, the more effective it's going to be. The reality is, a lot of times when we implement countermeasures or strategies, they may not be as effective as they could be. So we want to make sure we select ones that make sense given our resources and our communities, and we just give you 16 different factors that you might consider in making that decision. And then finally, we're going to have to think about adapting. Every setting is different, every community is different, and we're going to have to make some changes to potentially a strategy or a countermeasure, but we want to do that really carefully. Because if we take out something that is critical to how the countermeasure works, then the countermeasure isn't going to work. We're not going to see the outcomes. And that's why we had that second chapter about understanding how countermeasures work. And we really encourage people to create a logic model for the countermeasures that they select so they understand how it works. And that's why we created a video to sort of walk through doing that. There's a really cool tool that people use in adapting. It uses a transportation metaphor of a stoplight, although this strategy was developed not for transportation related countermeasures. It really comes from the public health world. But it's this idea of red light, yellow light, green light. And you would get a bunch of stakeholders around a table and you'd talk about implementing the strategy, and you'd say, okay, if we implement this strategy, what if we didn't do this part of it? What if we eliminated this component? And everybody around the table sort of makes a decision. Is that a red light thing? Like, no, that's got to be in there, because if we don't have that element, we're not going to see outcomes. Is it a yellow light thing? Maybe we'd cautiously get rid of that, but we'd have to really think about it. Or is it a green light thing where we'd say, no, I think we could really eliminate that. That's not going to be a critical component. So we provide a little bit of an example around that and some guidance about how to adapt strategies. And then finally, the last component is around evaluative thinking. And this is this idea that, you know, we're not going to do a strategy or a countermeasure just once. We're going to do it multiple times. And we need to get better each time we do it. So there are a few things that we can add during implementation that can help us get better. There's something called process evaluations, where we just gather some information about what we actually did. not so much about whether it was effective or not, but just what did people actually do? When we said we were going to have an activity and it was going to engage, 500 people in our rural community, how many people actually came? And we find out, only 20 people came. Well, that's a big thing for us to talk about, because if we thought it was going to reach 500 people and it only reached 20 people, that's going to have a profound impact on the outcomes. So process evaluations just allow us to learn, how did the implementation go in terms of what we thought would happen? And we can make a lot of decisions the next time based on process evaluations to do it better. Outcome evaluations can be a little bit trickier, but this might be, are we starting to see changes in beliefs? Are we starting to see changes in behaviors? Are we starting to see changes in consequences? But sometimes that's really hard to measure, and sometimes that lags in time. So we'll talk through that a little bit in this chapter, but it is a much more daunting thing to do some of the outcome evaluations, but absolutely very doable to do the process evaluations. And the process evaluation can really help us improve implementation. So this guide is available to you. Again, it really covers how behavioral strategies work. This is important because you need to know how they work, because you're going to probably have to adapt them. And you want to make sure when you adapt them, you don't lose the parts that are critical to getting the outcomes. We provide guidance on a process, so you can think about your work through the lens of engaging in a process, what to do next. We provide guidance on identifying, selecting, and adapting countermeasures and strategies. Unfortunately, there isn't a list just for rural and tribal settings. The research showed the evaluations have not been done. But we can look at other strategies that have been used in more urban settings and think about adapting them. So this is guidance that will help you find those, select those, and think about adapting them. And finally, we really want to think about this notion. We're not going to just do this once. We need to get better every time we do it. So we want to grow evaluative thinking skills. These are QR codes to the document as well as the logic model, but I know Jamie's also going to share that in the chat so you can have those. You can also Google, highway safety behavioral strategies for rural and tribal areas. It'll come up with that. So there are a number of different ways you can find the document. And again, do not be concerned with the fact that it says buy this book. That's just generic that they put on there. There's no cost for it. It is free. You can get access to it. So thank you very much for your time today. We've got an opportunity to answer some questions. But I really want to thank you for joining us, and also thank you for the work that you do. And then, keep in mind, we've got a whole nother presentation right after this from Jim, who's going to talk about concrete strategies that they're using in Vermont in rural settings and how you might be able to learn and use some of those as well. So I will open it up to Jamie and others in terms of any questions.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Jay. So if anyone does have any questions, you can put those over in the Q&A pod over on the right-hand side right now. We do have one thing that came in for you so far, Jay. It's not really a question, but more just a statement. It says, many times rural roads are difficult for enforcement and first responders. There's a great need of coordination between law enforcement and engineering for enforcement turnouts, emergency pullouts for breakdowns, etc.
Yeah, that is a huge challenge, right? I mean, when we think about the elements of a safe system approach and we think about post-crash care, it is a tremendous challenge when we think about time to get to folks, time to get folks to, appropriate health services. I think there's some interesting conversations and things folks are thinking about in terms of potentially leveraging and promoting technology. Like there is a bit more of this notion of cell phones potentially being able to detect somebody having been in a crash. So, I mean, if somebody's in a crash and it's a really rural, isolated road and nobody knows about it for a while, that's tragic. So to think about, are there opportunities to elevate technical solutions to help notify, but absolutely in terms of the challenge of roadway design, to be able to have places for emergency vehicles, Absolutely, enforcement being a major challenge in rural areas with limited just huge territories and limited resources. And then we know across the nation, but in certain settings, law enforcement is understaffed. So even more challenges there. So yes, this is trying times. These are difficult times. And so leaning into those issues, bringing those up, bringing those folks around the table to start talking about that and elevating that. But certainly no easy answers there for sure.
And it doesn't look like at this time we have any more questions. So I do just want to remind everyone, I put in the chat pod the link that will get you both to this guide, but also if you scroll down below the picture of the guide, there is also a link to the full report that Jay was mentioning that has a lot of that information in the literature review about finding some of these countermeasures. I also did put in the chat pod the link for the training video he mentioned as well. And as I said, there are no more questions. There actually is one more that just came in. So Jay, that question for you is, do you have any suggestions for recruiting stakeholders?
Yeah, that's always hard. I think what I would do heavily to recruit stakeholders is I would look around for what's already going on. And the challenge in rural settings is to come in and say, like, we need to have another group working on anything, right? Because in rural settings, there are just not that many folks, and the folks are often already involved in so many things. So I would reach out to your public health folks and say, what's happening in my community around public health? And what is the focus of those issues around public health? And are you all talking about traffic safety as a public health issue? Traffic safety should be talked about as a public health issue, and rural public health, I think, has a potential opportunity to involve more on traffic safety. Often you may find there are some existing efforts going on around public health aspects, and then you could say, could we include traffic safety in that? Could I attend part of a meeting? Could you think about a subcommittee of that group who might work on traffic safety? So you leverage that existing work. Another area I would look at is who's working on preventing underage drinking. Usually that is broad as well across the country. There are a lot of different federal funding sources that have sought to increase engagement on addressing underage drinking and underage substance use. And this is a key group to connect with too, and recognizing that the primary reason, they may not even know this, but one of the primary reasons we work to reduce underage drinking is because underage drinking is associated with underage fatal car crashes. So underage drinking prevention is traffic safety work. And so connecting to that group and saying, okay, you may have a lot of stakeholders around the table. Could some of those stakeholders also be involved with traffic safety? Because traffic issues are a major concern with young people as well. It's a leading cause of death amongst youth. So it intersects with their outcomes as well. So I think it's really about, you may think about starting a new group, but I would really look around to folks who are already working in any aspect of health and safety and seeing if you can leverage their group. Because I think if you were to go out and recruit new folks, many of them may be already involved in those other efforts. And then it's easier to connect and share resources with them as opposed to starting a new group. It takes time. The guidance we often talk to people is like 50 cups of coffee. So if I'm in a community, it just begins getting out and talking to a stakeholder and just introducing them. Do they understand how important traffic safety is? Do they get that it's a major public health issue? It may be the leading cause of death of people in their community. And slowly over time, building up that network of folks. But it is hard, and it does take quite a bit of time and energy.
Perfect. Thank you, Jay. And we did have a comment about this too, that many states and communities have very successful community traffic safety teams. That came into the chat pod. And to address that as well, in the chat, I did put a link to another resource that Jay actually helped us work on for the National Center for Rural Road Safety, and that's on guidance on growing traffic safety culture. And it talks about some of these coalitions and groups that were created in rural areas. And so it's another great resource for stakeholders. And I dropped that in the chat pod in case you're interested in hearing more about that. At this time, I'm excited to turn over our webinar to Jim Sullivan, who's going to talk about some work he's been doing for Vermont. So Jim?
Thanks, Jamie, and thanks, Jay, for your presentation and providing a little bit of context for what I'm going to talk about. I think it's worth noting, as Jay alluded to, what we're going to be kind of shifting direction a little bit here and talking more specifically about specific countermeasures that are aimed at counteracting speeding, and whereas there are broader countermeasures that can be used for a variety of travel behaviors that are undesirable. In this case, we're just talking about speeding, and kind of the presumption is that we understand the connection between speeding and safety. We don't get into that in detail in the document. There aren't facts and figures about how speeding relates to poor safety outcomes, but so it's really just down to the specific idea of folks wanting to combat speeding and how they can go about selecting countermeasures for that. I'm also not, this isn't a PowerPoint presentation. This is the actual toolbox document that we produced for the Agency of Transportation. We were tasked with producing something that would be accessible and useful by non-engineering folks at our towns, folks like transportation planners and roadway superintendents who might be on the front lines of implementing some of these kinds of countermeasures. So I'm just going to walk through the document because we're pretty happy with it. The state's been pretty happy with it, and we think it's the best way to showcase the work. So as I alluded to, the purpose of the document was twofold. We were really initially trying to provide our users with an indication of what's involved with implementing a speeding countermeasure in their towns, really giving them the sense that it's more than it might seem at first. It's not something that is simply about buying a product and throwing it down in the road and then getting results, or putting it on the side of the road and getting results. We have seen examples of where vendors almost kind of lead the process, which isn't great. So we really wanted to give them an indication that it's something bigger, something to be really thought through in planning, selecting, and implementing, but then also provide them a good information starting point. The toolbox style guide provides them with some basic information about what the countermeasures are and the types of countermeasures they can consider, with design considerations and context, so that they can go forward and use this as a jumping off point to get more detailed information. As I said, this is simply a PDF document, can be easily circulated and shared as such. We did consider early in the project the possibility of creating a website based in an HTML designed pages. We decided against that eventually in discussion with our advisory committee on the project, because we still thought that it was going to be useful for folks to just simply print it out, and it does print out nicely. As well as to just capture the individual fact sheets and profile sheets as just single pages, again, that they could print out individually or use individually, whereas some of the HTML-based web resources that we've seen and consulted don't kind of really display or they're not as useful as sort of single kind of fact sheet style displays. So we went with a PDF document, but it's a dynamic PDF document in that it features a wide variety of links, both within the document, so links within the document to other places in the document, and then dynamic links from within the document out to web resources, so live links that take you out of the document. So, so those things make it a little bit more dynamic than a simple static PDF. We also had a very involved TAC from the agency and a few TAC members outside of the agency that really helped guide us through the process, including our project champion, Josh Taylor. And so the contents page is what the user encounters first, and it's a good example of how we implemented live links to each of the sections in the contents. So a user can click on any of the headings here and be taken to a live link of the location in the document where that appears. So we include some opening sections in the document, the first 5 listed here, before getting into what is really the crux of the document, which is the profile sheets. And we have profile sheets for 15 recommended speeding countermeasures that were selected kind of with the specific Vermont context in mind. We distilled that information from a variety of outside sources and then provide individual profile sheets for each of those in the toolbox. That's really the crux of what the toolbox is. And then we have field test fact sheets and case study fact sheets that I'll talk more about. So the first section, we describe what speeding countermeasures are, a lot of what I've already talked about, and how the toolbox is intended to be used. We also talk specifically about the idea of transition zones. For many of us in rural states with villages and smaller villages and town centers, it's really in these transition zones that speeding is a problem. And it's really many of our villages and town centers, what prompts them to start to think about wanting speeding countermeasures is the presence of vehicles moving from a high-speed rural highway into a community where speeds are reduced considerably and not bringing down their speeds quickly enough or completely enough. We also, what you also see here is we have several places in the opening text of the document where there is some text that's underlined, and each of those portions is a live link to somewhere else in the document, and I'll talk more about that as we go through. We follow that with sections on maintenance. For those of us, I think the folks in Montana understand the importance in particular of considering how snow and ice control is going to be conducted, specifically around engineered countermeasures like vertical and horizontal deflections. And that's definitely something, as well as things that are painted on the surface and how they can wear more quickly due to winter maintenance activities. So just a brief section on that, again, to get folks thinking. We're really not trying to provide specific operating procedures for that. We just want to get you thinking that, oh, this is something that may have to be removed in the winter, or certainly is going to change the way we think about the maintenance that we commit to it in the future. And then the next 2 sections, which I think are really kind of came out of a lot of the research that went into the document, is a description of strategies that are often thought to be speeding countermeasures, but actually are not intended as speeding countermeasures. So they're often mistaken and often used incorrectly. So we have a brief description of what some of those things are, and then we follow that with a section on describing a specific speeding countermeasure that we've seen and in places in Vermont and which is not currently approved for use as a speeding countermeasure, and I'll describe that some more as well. But things like, you know, in the previous section, things like stop signs, adding a stop control at an intersection is often thought to be a speeding countermeasure, but what we found with research is that it often leads to more dangerous behavior as drivers speed up between the stop signs and try to make up time. So things, you know, that might intuitively seem like, oh, this is a good idea, and we'll reduce speeds this way, that we're trying to sort of caution folks to not think of them that way. Then that follows with a section on definitions and related concepts. We provide information here about things that end up in the discussion when you talk about speeding countermeasures, but often have kind of misunderstandings or multiple meanings. And we wanted to just clear up with, you know, ideas like what is a road diet, or what is the term complete streets refer to. We wanted to clear up right off the bat exactly what we consider these terms to mean and how they're going to be used in this document, as well as providing just some indications of some terms and phrases that we see, terms like edge island, which we're not sure that you know all of the folks who use this document would understand without some explanation. So we provide some of that here. Examples here are shown to how we treated citations in the document where they're underlined. So anytime any of the text is underlined, that's a link to elsewhere in the document. So all of our citations are underlined. We're exhaustively reviewed and distilled information from a wide variety of resources, and then have those listed here. And so if the user wants to look in more detail at any of the citations, they can click on the underlined citation, and it brings them back down to the end of the document where our resources section is. And they can see the complete citation for that resource, and they can also click on a specific resource, and it goes with a live link out to the web page where that link exists. Mine are opening in a different monitor, so I'm just going to drag this one over. So you can see this, you know, from clicking on that link, it went to a the live web location of Delaware's traffic calming design manual, which we used to a good degree in this project. Just want to make sure that showed up for you. If I dragged it over. Yeah, there it is. Okay. So yeah, so that's just another example of how we, you know, provided these dynamic links in the document, and I'll jump back up where we were. And so that's anywhere that you see an underlined citation, that takes you down to the resources section, and then you can navigate out to the web to see that resource, a live link from the resources section. So then on page 7 is where we really start the crux of the document with our profile sheets. And we give a little bit of information on the profile sheets to start with, but I'll talk in more detail about them as we go through. We also talk about the 4 resources in particular that were particularly useful to us in selecting speeding countermeasures that were really more well suited to the Vermont context. 3 of those are Canadian resources, and as well as the federal highway guidance. And so those documents in particular gave us good examples of experiences that we could borrow from for the Vermont context. And so the profiles of our speeding countermeasures, and we have 15, a final set of 15 that we selected, and this was through evaluating other regions and resources, other toolboxes, and what they considered for their regions, and and then also in interaction with our TAC, with our advisory committee, trying to determine which would be the countermeasures that we could consider for use here in Vermont. And so the profiles section starts with what we call an acceptability and applicability table. And again, a lot of the toolboxes that we looked at, this was an example of something they all featured, and so we followed suit with it. And what you see here is basically a identification of what each of the speeding countermeasures by type. We have horizontal deflections, vertical deflections, and then perceptual or passive countermeasures, which are often things that are on the road surface or on the side of the road, intended more in relation to what Jay was talking about, intended to affect kind of behavior in a more perceptual way. And then within our applicability and acceptability table, we kind of rate just a very broad kind of rule of thumb type of a rating system for each of the countermeasures in terms of 8 different criteria that, again, we selected in consultation with our advisory committee. And it's interesting with Jay talking about the red light and green light and yellow light. We had originally thought it'd be neat to have a green light and a yellow light and a red light as the indicators for these, but we reconsidered when we considered the potential for folks with vision impairments to possibly have that stuff need to be read aloud, and maybe this system would work more would work better for that. So in the table you see each of the countermeasures with a rough sort of rating in terms of each both frequency of use in Vermont, how the countermeasure could be handled by snow and ice control, how it could be navigated by emergency response vehicles, what level, how favorable the cost and the maintenance responsibility will be, as well as how favorable its speed reduction potential is. These different countermeasures work more or less effectively at reducing speeds, and so we give a general indication there. And then the next 2 columns, one indicating whether it's something that we would use within the village or town center once we had passed the last indication of a low speed zone, less than 35 miles an hour, or within the transition zone itself, where we're bringing rural highway speeds, typically from 50 or 55 miles an hour down to something lower than 35. So different countermeasures are more applicable in different contexts with respect to transition zones. And then the last column we added to indicate whether this would be a countermeasure that the state would consider for a state highway. Although, the intent of our intended users are the towns in Vermont. Often in the transition zones, there's a point where rural highway goes from being the responsibility of the state to being the responsibility of the town. And so just in case the town is considering countermeasures that are in the transition zone, we wanted them to be aware that there are certain countermeasures that the state would not consider putting on a state highway. So, and then also giving them the idea that they should feel free to go to the agency to look for more assistance and review of what their strategies are. Often, one of the issues that prompted the development of this toolbox is towns implementing things without really consulting the state or consulting more comprehensive engineering resources, and we saw and we see a lot of examples of countermeasures that are not selected well, not implemented properly, not built properly, and consequently don't work as well as they could. So we're really trying also within this document to connect towns to our state our state decision makers as well. So what we'll see here in the applicability and acceptability table is each of the speeding countermeasure names are underlined, meaning that they provide the user with a live link down to one or more of the profile sheets themselves, which are the 15 profile sheets follow the applicability and acceptability table. And so you could just navigate. They just start on the next page, but the name link here just gives you a quick way to get back down to, if you were looking at raised intersections and you clicked on that, it would jump right down to the profile sheet on raised intersections. And then within the profile sheets themselves, we put each of the profile sheets on a template that we decided on in collaboration with our TAC, and then we kept it consistent between all 15 of our speeding countermeasures. And the profile sheets themselves also include quite a few live links, and I'll go through those as we navigate through the profile sheets. One is clicking on the banner in the top left corner, takes the user back to the contents of the document. And then, of course, we could go back to the profiles from the contents. The other is in the section below for further information, we list the specific citations that were used in the information, in processing the information that's shown on this particular profile sheet. And if the user clicks on that section, it's similar to where the citations are underlined. It takes them down to the resources section, so they can look up a specific resource and click on it, and it takes them again out to the live link where they can find the citation that specifically that was listed. So if they're looking at a particular profile sheet and they want to see what one of the documents that was used in its development looks like, they can get there. Again, navigating through, start at the first one. Navigating through, we have 15 of these, and they all look fairly consistent. We identify the type of countermeasure, horizontal or vertical deflection, or perceptual or passive measure, the name of the countermeasure, a brief one-line description of the countermeasure, and then a more slightly more detailed description in the larger text here, and then two further more detailed sections. One providing an idea of the context where the countermeasure is most useful, and then the other one providing some design considerations. And it's important to note here that it's not intended to be a design guidance. We're trying to give the user the idea that these are not simple things often to install. There's a context to think about, and then there's this particular way, but particularly for the horizontal and vertical deflections, that these need to be designed. So we're trying to sort of give them a jumping off point to look for more information, which is where the links down below would come in handy. If folks just wanted to see the information more quickly, on the left bar here, we provide facts at a glance, really just some bulleted pros and cons pertaining to this particular countermeasure. And then the last section on the left bar is just describing the frequency of use of this countermeasure in Vermont. And then also, as you'll see on some of the following profile sheets, we provide live links down in that section on that left bar under use in Vermont to our case studies and our field tests. And this is where the research team here at the UVM Transportation Research Center really got to kind of add a little bit more of a research component to the project to give it more Vermont context. So I'll talk about these case studies and field tests when I get down to them, but the live links here jump to them because in many cases the countermeasure that's being described on the profile sheet, we have an actual case study or a field test where that's relevant to it. So the user can get more information about the specific Vermont context by clicking on that underlined link and jumping down to a case study fact sheet and reading about that. And I'll talk more about those in a moment or when I get down to them. But I want to keep talking more about the profile sheets for now as we navigate through them. So the other feature we have on the profile sheets is that all of the photographs, we used Google Street View and Aerial View wherever we could for the reason that when we do have photographs that are pulled from Google Street View or Aerial View, they contain live links as well. So if the user is hovering over the Street View image at the top of this bulb out pinch point choker profile sheet and they click on it, they're taken to the live current Street View where that countermeasure is implemented. So they can navigate to that. The interesting thing here is that you really have to take note when you look at Google Street View of when the image was captured. We do have some examples where we know countermeasure was implemented, but it's an area of the state, especially in rural states. Some of the more far-flung areas, extremely rural areas, the image capture from Google is very old, and it may not even show the latest example of the countermeasure that we know is there. So use a little bit of caution, but I mean, we're assuming they're updating and they're still driving by our most rural towns and villages. So at some point they'll be updated. But in any case, where we have it available, the link is there and the user can navigate out to the live image. Median islands, mini roundabouts, and again, a note about the images. Wherever we could, these images are from Vermont. I think for 14 out of our 15 countermeasures, we have an example from Vermont. And so when the user clicks on the link, they're taken out and it's an image, in Vermont. Again, just to give folks the Vermont context, give them the sense that, hey, you're considering this countermeasure, it has been done. And getting the towns talking to one another, which is an important way to prompt, the information trail that gets them to more mature design guidance. Neighborhood traffic circles, speed humps or cushions, raised crosswalks, raised intersections, and then road diet. The road diet idea and definition that we use in the document is kind of most specifically consistent with the federal highway definition, which is typically turning a 4-lane, 2 lanes each way road into a 1 lane each way with a center 2-way left turn lane. Radar speed feedback signs, which are very popular in Vermont, and I think probably in a lot of our rural towns in transition zones. Transverse line markings, gateway signing. Transverse mumble strips we added, we learned about mumble strips from the folks in Minnesota who have been using them to control speeds, and they're just kind of less sharp, more kind of dulled down rumble strips. So they use cabin noise and vibration to alert the driver that there's reduced speeds. And these are, within the lane itself, so that it's not the same as a rumble strip that's used to prevent vehicles from drifting off the roadway. And Minnesota's been using these, and they have them now in I think about 40 different places statewide. We don't have any examples yet in Vermont, but this was an example of where we found something that we thought we would include in the guide, and just to let folks know it's out there. We had thought maybe it wouldn't be as effective in winter, but in Minnesota they've been saying that they've been doing okay. So we included them here, and again the live link to the Google location would take the user out, and you can see the mumble strips there in place on Minnesota 68. And then slow or 25-mile-an-hour pavement markings, which we see a lot of. So then getting into our fact sheets and our case studies, again, this was an area where we really wanted to add more specific Vermont-focused information to the toolbox. So we conducted some field data collection, both in the form of these field tests and also in the form of interview-based case studies. The field tests the purpose of those was really twofold, and we conducted 4 of them. One of the purposes was just to show folks who use the toolbox what the kind of data collection that is typically involved with implementing a speeding countermeasure would look like, the types of data you should collect beforehand to see what's going on at the site. So we wanted to provide some examples of that. And additionally, we wanted to actually evaluate a few sites that were coming up in our conversations with folks in the towns, and see how locations like Hardwick on Vermont 14 and Middlebury on Vermont 30, where there are no speeding countermeasures yet, see how those were doing in terms of real speeding, because often folks are anecdotally thinking, well, there's lots of speeding here and something needs to be done. But then if we go out and test the speeds, we may find that, in fact, folks are abiding pretty well by the speed limit. So there might be a problem with the speed limit, and folks might want to lower the speed limit, which is outside of the scope of this document. That's more speed management and enforcement. So we conducted these field tests, and again, the first 2 examples are places where there aren't countermeasures, and we collected data to see what was happening. And then the second 2, Middlebury, Vermont 125, and Virgins, Vermont 22A, are locations where there are speeding countermeasures, and we could look at what's going on there. And so here in the example of Hardwick, Vermont 14, we can see the first of these fact sheets. And again, we compiled all the information on each field test into a single fact sheet. And we describe the context a bit and provide more live linked photos. And then we describe the data collection that we conducted, and provide this it's a pretty busy chart, but we have a small amount of space to provide a lot of information. And the chart provides all of the data we collected, which is in the orange line is the average speeds of the vehicles. In the gray line is the 85th percentile speeds of the vehicles we monitored. And then the lighter blue line, the straight line, is the speed limit. And in yellow at the top is the percentage of vehicles that were exceeding the speed limit. And then in darker blue, the kind of sinusoidal curves that you see there is the traffic volume. So you can see at night when the traffic volumes go way down to 0. And so what you could see, for example, from this site is there are no countermeasures in place. Folks have reported problems with speeding, and they do have problems with speeding. Nearly 100% of the traffic is exceeding the speed limit almost all the time. The 85th percentile speed and the average speed are almost never at or below the speed limit. So this is an area where you would want to think about, hey, there needs to be something done if we're going to continue to think folks are going to travel 25 miles an hour coming into the town of Hardwick. And as you can see at the bottom left, this is our data collection rig, a trailer mounted data collection device. But I like that picture because it shows that we collect data in all kinds of weather, and often that's the first thing folks ask. Well, this is happening in the summer, but is it happening in the winter? So we made sure we covered a variety of seasons. Middlebury, Vermont 30 coming into the town of Middlebury is a good example because there are no countermeasures in place, but things really aren't so bad here. There's an incline coming into the town at this location, which kind of naturally brings speeds down. So this is another example where you might, collect data and say, really, things are okay here. Folks are abiding by the 35-mile-an-hour speed limit generally. So you would, after conducting the data collection, find that, maybe you don't need a speeding countermeasure here. Middlebury, Vermont 125, on the other hand, is a location, it's kind of a showcase for, in Vermont for speeding countermeasures. We have a number of countermeasures, including lane narrowing and bulb outs and lighted crosswalks and on-street parking. And they really serve to provide those visual cues and reminders that folks are entering an area with a lot of pedestrians, are entering, really kind of cutting right through the Middlebury College campus. And so, again, we conducted the speed test and find that most of the time, almost everyone is at or below the speed limit. So really a success story here for speeding countermeasures. And again, we're giving users examples of stuff that's been done. And then we're also giving them kind of points where they can look for more information and maybe make contact with another town that's done something similar. Regens on Vermont 22A is a speed feedback sign that is not working all that well. So an example of where a speeding countermeasure in a transition zone is not terribly effective, and we've still got a problem. So another type of example there. The last four fact sheets are case studies. These were interview-based, so we talked to different people who had been involved with successful and unsuccessful speeding countermeasures in some of our towns. And again, the idea here is to give an idea for the user to see some lessons learned, to see that it's not always straightforward. We build this thing and we put it in and speeds come down. It doesn't always work that way. And we've got 4 of those where we reached out and conducted interviews with stakeholders in 4 of our towns. And the other interesting thing here is that we have some examples in our case studies of speeding countermeasures that, well, in many cases they weren't put in correctly, or they were the way we cautioned in the introductory section. There were things put in that we don't consider speeding countermeasures that the towns thought would reduce speeds, like a 4-way stop. And we can see, real examples of where those things didn't work. So we see kind of in the case studies, kind of the good and bad, and that we thought would be really, really interesting for a user to see that they've got to think carefully about these things. And again, throughout even these case study fact sheets, we have live linkages if the user wants to jump out to the location in Google Maps where things were being talked about, they can do that. And that is, and then we have the resources, and again, those are live linked out, and that's it for the document. So I appreciate your time, and I appreciate being asked to do this by Jamie, and appreciate Jay's co-presentation. I think it worked real well, and I'll be open for questions.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Jim. So again, for everyone, I've posted both the link for this toolbox in the chat pod, but also the PDF version is also one of the 2 handouts that are available. The other handout is the copy of Jay's slides. So just a reminder that those are in both the chat pod and the handout pod. If you do have any questions, go ahead and put those in the question pod for us at this point in time. I'm going to start with the ones that are already there, and then we'll get to those you may still have that may be coming in. So Jim, the first question that we have for you is for the lateral shift fact sheet that you showed. The shoulders on each side of the island are narrowed. What is the minimum width of the shoulders that AOT allows in such situations?
That's a good question and a tough one. I don't see who all of our 223 attendees are, but it's possible that some of them were from my advisory committee and could do a better job of answering that question. I think it's going to depend on whether we've reached the point where the state highway ends or not. And I'll go down to, whoops. I'll navigate down to, it was the lane narrowing?
The lateral shift fact sheet.
Oh, lateral shift, yeah. Yeah, I don't know if we are still on the state highway or not. If you're getting at that those shoulders have been reduced and that might not be allowed on a state highway, that's possible. And we may have just left the state maintained portion of the state highway. But I'm going to have to give you an I don't know.
Okay, perfect. And for the person who did ask that, if you would like to send an email to info@ruralsafetycenter.org, I will put you in touch with some of the VTrans people who may be able to answer that question for you. The second thing that we have for you is not necessarily a question, but more of a suggestion, is just that in some cases, there are no pictures on Google. When Google does not cover pictures, you could check out Bing Maps Street Side because they may have some of those additional pictures that Google will not have. They mentioned that they think there's another road log site out there as well as the one that you showed, and they may be able to send a link to it, and actually did. So I will forward this to you. After the fact, Jim, there is a link to another crowdsourced road log with signs that are highlighted and imagery from DOTs as well. So I'll send that along for you as another example. And then someone else did ask as a question that they're having a hard time downloading the 2 PDFs. So I will reach out to you individually after today's webinar to get those to you. And those are the only questions we had, Jim. So thank you so much for doing that. Oh, again, as I say that, one more came in. So the last question we have for you, Jim, is do you include guidance on drainage and snow control in the toolbox? No, we don't. We purposely tried to steer away from getting into stuff that is too designy. We didn't want users to think this could be your design guidance. That's really what so we kind of had more, and then we thought, let's pull back a little bit because we don't want their search for information to end here. We really want it to be a jumping off point. So no, we don't get into details about drainage and snow and ice control. There are in the design considerations of each of the profile sheets, there is some information, but again, not specific enough that you could design something from this document alone, and that was purposeful. So I just want to take a second again to thank both Jay and Jim for doing those fantastic presentations. I'm really excited that we have both these 2 new resources out there. Again, you can download them either from the chat pod or from the handout pod. You can always reach out to us at info@ruralsafetycenter.org if you have any other questions, and we will get those to either Jay or Jim. You can also follow us on social media. And we are hoping to have one more webinar later this month, so watch out for our email distribution list to find out more information about that. And if you are joining us for our Road Safety Champion Program core modules, we have our final one tomorrow. That will be core module 3 on traffic safety culture. And you can sign up for attending that on our website under register for trainings. So thank you again one more time to Jay and Jim, and have a great afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.